Okay, so I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for joining us here this morning at the International Social Capital Association and our inaugural meeting of the Special Interest Group into Disaster Resilience. My name is Dr. Jeff Donaldson. There you go. I am the founder, voice, pilot, steerer, whatever you want to call it, of the Special Interest Group. I'm just going to share my screen now and start up a presentation for us. And so basically what we intend to do here today is to talk about mapping social capital for emergency preparedness through identification of societal institutions. My intent is to speak for about 30 minutes. Those of you who do know me, I'm quite passionate, unapologetically passionate about this subject matter. So I may go a little bit beyond that, but the intent is just to chat for 30 minutes because what we really want to do is generate discussion amongst all of us. So our roadmap for today is first, I want to talk about the orientation of the special interest group, why it exists, why we created it, a little bit about operationalization, I love that word, of social capital theory, some challenges in emergency management, and then we're going to get into the meat of what we're talking about today: preparedness, network identification, mapping societal institutions. And this is a presentation of an idea that I've been working on for quite a number of years on how to help understand relationships as they exist. And so, but first of all, our orientation and why we created this. We are looking to create a forum for interested parties, experts, practitioners, academics, researchers, politicians, and everybody who has an interest to discuss the role and relationships within emergency management. We build resilience through relationships. We build by talking, by speaking, by creating a group of people who are interested in exchanging ideas. This is far less of a lecture series of high intensity academic articles and more a place where we can create a space for discourse, where people can exchange ideas, where problems that are facing emergency managers can then be looked at by researchers and academics and experts, basically creating a virtual roundtable where all of the parties involved in this field can get together, see value in their time there. And we do that through a mighty network platform that exists within the International Social Capital Association. It is free of charge to join. You just get a login, etc., and you get into that space, and that's where we put a lot of material up. That's where we have our discussions. It creates a forum outside of a LinkedIn group that exists as well, outside of Facebook groups. But this is a place where we who are interested in disaster resilience and the role of relationships within disaster resilience, where we can get together and begin our discussions. But we also know that this is the age of disruption that we live in. I mean, the 2010s is an incredibly chaotic decade. And so when we talk about resilience, I think it's important to offer a definition. As you see there, my definition is just X's ability to absorb and recover from exogenous shocks and the fact that it's built through relationships. Now, resilience is very much like emergency or the word disaster. There is no less than 30 plus academically approved and peer-reviewed published definitions of resilience out there. The UNDRR has their own. The reason I choose a generalistic description like this is because you get to define what X is, you get to define what a level of acceptable absorption is, and what recovery looks like from you. And we understand that this is all about exogenous shock, things that happen to you that are beyond your control. You did not initiate it, and you can't control it. And the reason we want to talk about social capital theory and talk about relationships is we want to move beyond the literature. We want to bring the discussion to practical applications of the theoretical frameworks. There's a lot of fantastic academic articles that exist out there, and we continue to support the publication of those. But there is a space that's not occupied right now that talks about moving beyond it and how do we take the information in the academic article and make it practical for the people on the ground that are executing the task. When we can do that and figure out the methodology and the space for that, now we build that relationship. The practitioner sees the value in a special interest group on disaster resilience because they get to speak one-on-one with the academics and the researchers that are doing that kind of work. And we build models for better understanding of the phenomena that we experience in the world. And just to frame the world of emergency management and resilience for a bit, there are a couple of notable challenges that I think are worth note. Number one is preparedness communications. Whether you look at the CEPR, which was a study done in 2014 in Canada, whether you look at FEMA training or any national study, people are not prepared, or what we would consider to be prepared. And our preparedness communications are, for all intents and purposes, ineffective at changing behavior in the population. We have a loss of institutional trust. The pandemic, irrespective of how you fall on the conduct of government institutions during the pandemic, the clear evidence is we have a reduction now in institutional trust that exists in it. Resource allocation is always a challenge in emergency management. Here in Canada, emergency management competes with healthcare, education, daycare, pharmacare. There simply will not be any more money for emergency management, irrespective of the need and the desire of the people in it. So resource allocation will remain a pressure that's not going to get solved. Population relevancy is one I think we don't talk about enough. In the pandemic, public health took the lead. Some would argue it was an emergency management responsibility. Now, within emergency management field, we believe that emergency management is relevant, but does the population you serve see the relevant realization and why emergency management is there? Because if the trust and the validity is not there from your population, you can have significant problems. And then we have a perception gap. The belief between the population's belief of the capability and capacity of emergency management to execute a task versus their actual ability creates a gap. And if that gap is not appropriately managed, it looks like a failure, when in fact it was an incredible execution of finite resources, but because the perception of the population is so far out of whack, for lack of a better term, of what they can actually contribute, we have that problem. So those are just some of the frames that I think are important. But when we talk about preparedness, I think we have to kind of frame a definition again. Preparedness is no different than resilience. We're going to have a number of different definitions. My working one is the pre-event decisions that influence the ability to navigate that same exogenous shock. Remember, we're talking about events that happen that are out of your control. You did not initiate them. You cannot control them, but they're affecting how you conduct your normal life. The pre-event decisions that you make cognitively or physically make up your ability to influence your navigation of that. Now, the question, though, that we have, and I think this is one that we should debate, and I'm looking forward to your opinion in our question and answer period afterwards, is measuring preparedness. How do we define a prepared individual? If I was to say, over the side of my office here, I'm going to place an avatar, and that is a prepared individual, how would you describe that person? Would you describe that person who is capable of executing a set of tasks, which means a prepared individual is defined by a set of capabilities they have, or is a set of possessions? If they have the following 10 items, they can be defined as prepared. There's a body of people that believe that if I add possessions to an individual, they by default become prepared. So we have to understand that. And then how do you measure that? If you believe preparedness is a set of capabilities, how do you measure those capabilities? How do we understand? And then how do we prescribe a communication strategy to meet any identified shortfall? So when we look at the operationalization of the theory that exists, and we're bringing the academic articles down, it's about defining a process for people on the ground that are executing preparedness communications and responsible for preparedness within a defined community. How do they do it? Well, it's simply put, you have to define it. I'm not going to define it today for you, whether it's a prepared individual, capability, possession. But for example, if I was the emergency manager responsible for the city of Calgary, Alberta, here in Canada, if I was to I have to define what a prepared Calgarian is. I have to be able to measure it, right? Because once I measure it, I can identify the gap between the state of the Calgarian and where I want them to be. Then I can communicate what I need them to do. Then I have to measure it again to see if there's been any behavior adaptation from what I've issued. It's a rinse and repeat. If you've done any business courses, I've just told you marketing 101. That's exactly what preparedness communications are. It's a marketing strategy. And this book that I put up there by Professor Nancy Meyer Emmerich is, for me, the single greatest piece of work in preparedness communications and the introduction of marketing. I used it in my dissertation several years ago as one of the two grounds of my theoretical framework that I used for that. If you ever get a chance, I think it's something that's it's not a long read, but it's an incredibly important and transformational read. But then we have to kind of understand, why do people listen, right? Let's be honest. Why do people listen to information that they're told? First of all, we know from the literature and from studies that individuals turn to trusted sources in times of crisis. That's pretty straightforward. But what's a trusted source? Well, we best understand it to be pre-event relationships. So there has to be some pre-existing interaction between the individual and the source. They've provided some value or fact that the individual found to be important and valuable. It's usually a continuous, but not always. Sometimes it can be an infrequent, but it has to be viewed as an important exchange from the individual's point of view. The keynote here for those in industry is that individuals define trusted sources, not the state. The state is not in a position to determine what is or what is not a trusted source of information. For individuals, most of the time, it's their social capital. It's their family, their friends, their faith, their community, and their sectorial advocates that they will turn to in times of crisis. And if we understand that, then we can transform our viewpoint to look at society of a set of networks. Society is made up of a set of relationships based upon a set of connectedness to belonging, norms of reciprocity, and predispositions to cooperate that exist within our society. And the underlying theme of what I'm talking about today is trusted networks equal a higher message trust that's transferred across that network. So network identification, how do we do it? Well, I'm going to borrow this from my 28 years in the Canadian Army as an Army officer. We had something called intelligence preparation of the battle space. And what this meant, every time a military intended to conduct an operation and on a new piece of ground or a new location, we had a responsibility to understand everything that was going on in that space. We called it blue SA, red SA, yellow SA, green SA, white SA, and they all talked about different aspects. If you think about terrain, weather, we think about climate, we think about the cultural identity, the population, the density, the natural hazards, the routes, traffic roads, everything that we could possibly understand about a space is what we would need to know prior to deciding how we would interrogate or conduct an operation in it. I'm working on the theory, and the one that I'm going to be publishing in May of 2024 in a journal is going to be called The Intelligence Preparation of the Disaster Space. How do we, as people working within emergency management, create a framework, a step-by-step framework for that analysis to basically intimately understand the environment in which you operate? And from that, I'm going to give you a kind of background definition of how that works from a structure. Basically, society is made up of 4 spheres, a number of sectors, all with existing networks. So spheres, you will see this whether you're looking at the sociological, anthropological, whether you're looking at the public administration, public policy literature. It's all named differently, but we generally agree that there are 4 spheres in society. Sometimes family is called civil society. Sometimes government is called public sector. Business would be called corporate or private sector. But generally, this encompasses all of the activity that happens within society. And as a Venn diagram, a lot of the things that organizations or people may be interacted with is you find yourself at different points of this. You could be in the intersection of 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of these spheres. But in reality, there are sectors of society. And when we look, I just threw 15 up there. Some literature has up to 31 or 32 different identified sectors within society. And these are individual parts of society that operate independently in and of themselves, but they are connected to other elements of society. And if you think about society being made up of all of these different sectors as different networks, all operating within four spheres. And if you think about how sectoral mapping, I just pulled this example of secondary education, right? So we're talking about high school. When you start to think at the sector level, you start to identify the key players, key organizations, and potential key leadership that exist within a society. You're thinking trustees, school board, parent teacher associations, and unions. This is part of you executing that task, intelligence preparation of the disaster space, in that you're understanding from a theoretical and a viewpoint what your society looks like. So how do you do this? Of course, it's one thing to say to do it. It's another thing to map it out. So we recommend, or I recommend, that we start with what we call advocacy groups. And so when you think about the Catholic Church diocese, for example, if you're sitting in the city of Calgary, Alberta, I just love Calgary, so I'll use that all the time as an example. There are a number of Catholic churches, but the Catholic Church diocese, the head of it for the area, they'll speak on behalf of the Catholic Church. This is very close to what we refer to as bonding social capital in the literature. That is where you have homogeneity, and people are very, very common. Then we work to coordinating organizations, things like chambers of commerce, the United Way, community hubs. This is bridging social capital. So it is one voice that is connected to a number of different organizations and can speak on behalf of them. And for example, if you've ever had the privilege of working with marginalized communities in a population, obviously, a lot of times they are served by a very small number of, or sorry, a large number of very small organizations. So it may be 3 individuals in a van that provide coffee to the unhoused, right? They're not large enough and functioning enough to have a voice in society. So they work through the United Way to be their voice in public policy, their advocacy, and their coordination comes from those organizations. And so by identifying organizations like the United Way and Chambers of Commerce, you, through bridging social capital, have access to it. And then it's going through the exercise of sectoral mapping. And the intent of this is, what we're doing is identifying the presence of organizational elements within your community. Not every organization is going to be present. Not every organization is going to be active, but this gives you a sense of who's who and who's operating in the community. And it works out to be a network map. And yes, this is intentionally blurred out because what I'm trying to do is not, I use somebody else's map. But when you see, this could be a sectoral map of the faith community in your city, right? So the larger dots represent a higher density of population in the congregation. And then you start to see all of the links that link them together. And this is the coordinating. Now, you may first think, when you think about faith sectors, is all the Catholic churches are connected, the synagogues are connected, the mosques are connected, the Orthodox church is connected. But then you start to realize, in fact, a lot of these communities do gather fairly regularly together. One city that I've been working in for the last couple of weeks actually has a faith council, an active council where members of the world's prominent religions get together and talk about harmony and living together and how to help and protect each other in today's caustic climate, right? If you don't know that that resource exists within your city, then you're missing an opportunity of a coordinating organization. If you tap into them, they're already tapped into all of the faith community in your network. But the reality is, you have 15 networks that I showed, potentially up to 32. And when you put them together, it actually creates a 3D model of the integrated social networks that exist within your community. And you're looking at the left and the right are 2 different ways to express those and visualize them. There are some companies that do social capital software modeling that are able to produce this for you. Python is one. There are some other programs that you can purchase. I don't know of any freeware that, and I'd be happy to hear if anybody knows of freeware that does 3D modeling. But the idea being is you get to see the visualization of the sectors of your community, and you start to see the integration and the importance of visualizing this is you see that your society in which you serve, whether it be just, say, the University of Calgary, or whether it's a large dispersed rural area or an urban suburban area, is a healthy operating set of human connections that are already up and running, and your society is turning and burning, talking to each other, debating, discussing, and solving issues, whether you're involved as an emergency management individual or not. So the purpose of this whole exercise is the identification of key leadership. And what you're looking for is where nodes intersect, where membership is held in two organizations or by default, various different connections. That individual can be deemed to be a trusted figure in the population. And I say trusted figure from the perspective that if they have active and present connections through multiple institutions, then they do have a modicum of trust within that organization. Now, this sometimes what's interesting is when you do this exercise, you realize it's not the CEO that's connected, right? It's the director of sales. Everybody automatically thinks that if I'm going to speak to the faith community, I have to speak to the very person on the top. But a lot of times when we conduct these mapping exercises, we find out that the strong connections are not necessarily the head of the institution, but membership within the institution. The reason that's important is you start to understand these individuals and they represent finding your bridging social capital. This is an iterative process. I understand that if you're sitting in a city of 400,000 people and you have a staff of 1.5 individuals to do an emergency management, a task like this seems almost insurmountable to undertake. Right? Obviously, yes, but that's why it's laid out in what we believe, or I believe, to be a reasonably iterative process of hitting the key nodes first and then branching out over time. Cities that have done this reasonably successful measure it in months and years. This is not a strategy that is going to be done overnight. And then when we go from there, we think, what is the outcome of this? The outcome of this is we're trying to build an engagement strategy for the processing of preparedness communications. And we know that engagement can only occur once you've identified the key leadership and who hold trusted positions within society. Now, policymakers and institutions, whether you're sitting on the corporate side or whether you're sitting on the public sector side, are responsible for setting up what we refer to as the enabling environment, setting the conditions to foster social capital, right? Creating the spaces where people interact, where these key leadership are brought together. So imagine you're running emergency management in a city of 400,000 people. You face the same dilemmas that I spoke about earlier. You're looking to increase civilian engagement. You're looking to expand your network and hopefully build some trust within society. Who do you invite to a gathering? Well, the process that I've laid out is not it is a methodology to identify who's a key leadership within your community to bring in, because as a policymaker and as a member of an institution, you have to take the active step of setting up the enabling environment for that social capital to occur, to build. And the beauty of it is it builds a stock of social capital that can be used to influence other sources of capital, human, financial, physical capital. We think about, for you and I to trade resources, for you and I to trade education pieces, for you and I to trade even money and capital, we first have to establish that connection. So the social capital has often been referred to as the glue that holds society together and the lubricant that allows everything else to work. So my argument here is building that social capital between yourself and key leadership in the community sets the conditions where you can build that relationship. And then when necessary to engage, it enables the flow of these other important capitals that keep society running. And it increases a sense of cooperation and a sense of goodwill and solidarity within the community. In essence, it reaches the goal that I believe is an important avenue to pursue, which is new and innovative pathways for preparedness and crisis communications. And then what you get in the end is, I think, something incredible. You have key leadership within the community actively seeking out emergency management because of the relationships that you've built in advance. And so, what are the outcomes we're looking for? I've identified two that I think are key. One is a trusted distribution channel that increases the likelihood of message reception and behavioral adoption. If we wrap this back to what I first spoke about defining that prepared individual, and your goal when you're issuing preparedness information is to increase the adoption of a set of behaviors that you believe will lead to preparedness, the theory and the data tells us that trusted networks pass information at a higher degree, and people who receive information across trusted networks have a higher behavioral adoption. We know that to be true, and then therefore the theory is extended, and love to debate this if you wish, that by building these social networks, you have that. And I think another brilliant thing is something that isn't done very well in emergency management is creating a two-way communication to the served community. A lot of time, from a government perspective, from a public sector perspective, it's a one-way shoot. It's a fire and forget. Here's the message, go do it. But what we really are successful is when we get messages out and we get the needs in. We start to create a two-way conversation with the community we serve. And then you start to hear from the key leadership within the community what their needs are. Now you're starting to build your emergency management program off of identified needs, not what you think the community is in need of, not what you think the community wants you to do, but you've built a communicative pathway to where you get that information. And this figure that you see on the left here was taken from an emergency management operations center in a Canadian city. It was on the desk surrounding their control group, which is the group of the mayor and the key decision makers that are going to make decisions that impact the lives in the middle of a crisis of the population. And this is all of the sectors of government wrapping their arms around each other, understanding we're here to work together. And the one you can't see on the other side is representative of the population. So they already know ahead of time why they're sitting around that table when crisis is disrupting their community. And I thought that was just a brilliant photo. I asked permission to grab that photo and to use it. It just demonstrates right there what I'm trying to create, what we're trying to create in this special interest group within ISCA is that kind of group where you can imagine each one of those avatars being an expert, a researcher, a practitioner, gathering periodically to discuss issues of the day and items of the day that are important. I think that's the key reason we're here. And just to circle back before we open it up for questions, I think it's really we create this space. This is why the SIG is created. That's why Mighty Networks was opened free of charge for you to join, to create that space where all of us can get together. I'm really looking to connect anybody out there who wants to connect with me on LinkedIn. It's Jeff Donaldson, PhD on LinkedIn. Send me a request. Love to get into any type of discussions about this. That's my company on the left, Preparedness Labs Incorporated. I am a associate faculty at Royal Roads University in the Disaster and Emergency Management program. I'm actually teaching a capstone project right now, and I'm a proud founding member of the International Social Capital Association, which I think right now and is positioned to be the leading voice within the disaster resilience space to get together. So with that, I'm going to unshare the screen, and then I will be happy to open the floor to questions. I see a bunch of in the notes there. Do you? Okay, I'm going to quick look through the notes here.
So there's no questions there, Jeff, in the
Yeah.
chat per se. Thanks for the presentation. Really interesting. I might start with the first question if I can, and of course, everyone's welcome to post questions in the chat or perhaps raise your hand. We'll love to hear from you and get your thoughts on this. My question, it's part of a question, part of comment, is that social capital is often described as something like a meta capital, and you touched on this idea that it's kind of central to being able to get anything done or to do anything, and that it affects our ability to mobilize physical capital, human capital. Really, without social capital, it's difficult to get to do anything at all. And it's the example of one person acting alone can do nowhere near as much as people working together. So this is central, and when you understand the power of social capital and how important it is in the things that we do, we can see just how important it is, but it's so often overlooked. And we tend to focus on and favor individual actions rather than looking at the power of social capital to improve the outcomes that we're interested in. So it's clear, really, with all of this, your presentation and what we know about social capital, that we need to invest in social capital for disaster preparedness. And we also need to make better use of the social capital that we already have to improve the outcomes that we're most interested in. So there's not a question there, but interested in your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. And this is why I said on one of the earlier slides that resilience is best built through relationships. Now, we can implement policy, process and procedures, tactics, techniques, and procedures on the ground, emergency operations centers, incident command system, and a number of other protocols can be brought in to help build resilience, but we build it through relationships. And the reason I started on this challenge is one of the large challenges within emergency management is building that relationship. If you're a practitioner in the public sector, building that relationship within the community you serve, because you're often doing it as a second job off the corner of your desk, as the saying goes, or you have 1.5 human beings serving a 400,000 population city. And it's how do I build the relationship when I have a $5,000 print budget and I have no money to buy ads. You're very limited in the resources. And like you said, these relationships and what I'm trying to visualize is these relationships are existing within society. Your society is connected. It's operating, it's debating, it's solving issues. And instead of the exceptional effort that some are trying to do to create new pathways, to create new networks, to create new relationships and build from scratch, what I'm trying to suggest is an alternate method might be to tap into the existing networks that are there and not try to replace the trust of key leadership, but to leverage the trust of key leadership to try to get your message across. I think that's an opportunity for somebody who is sitting in the standard position of where they have exceptionally limited resources, both time and monetary. And as we see the level of preparedness in society, we see the level of challenges increasing, whether it be disasters, economic, political disasters are coming our way. These are all coming, and we're not going to get an increase in resources. So it's an interesting, different way to attempt to build those, as you said, incredibly important relationships that are there. John, go ahead. You have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Fantastic presentation. It really resonated a lot, and particularly Nancy Emmerich Meyer's book, which I've used in some of the work I've done. So I've worked for the Red Cross here in Australia. We designed a program which kind of is based around effectively around social capital and just disaster preparedness. I think one of the interesting things that I often was asked by people, like, what's the one thing you would tell people? And particularly our marketing and communications, they just want one thing. What's the one thing you can do? And so I would actually say, well, I think go and swap your phone numbers with your neighbour, or knock on their door, and you could see their faces kind of go, "Oh, you can see that's not what we're expecting, though. We're expecting, to your point of, if we have these 10 things, Don't you want to save 3 liters of water, or have $100 worth of cash?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I was thinking, I'm interested in your thoughts on how do we kind of shift that perception away from having, if place the 10 things in front of a person, they are prepared kind of approach to, this, which is way more intangible, but, clearly has more value. So I'm interested in your thoughts about how you might shift those kind of perceptions amongst funders or officials and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the question. Often when we do research, when people are asked why they're not prepared, there's a standard avoidance behavior. But a lot of the times, the number one choice is the economic barrier, because people perceive. Now, I have a podcast. I just yesterday released my 250th episode on preparedness of my podcast. Been going for 4 years. I have to give the plug here. But my message is preparedness is free. I believe that the economic barrier to adopting preparedness is a state-induced condition. It's not, because you do not need to spend any money to adopt a prepared life and become far more resilient. The first thing that I advocate for is exactly what you said. And if you listen to all of my work in the publications, it's go meet your neighbor, because they're the person who's going to pull you out. They're going to be banging on your door at 2 o'clock in the morning when your roof is on fire. They're the ones that are going to pull you out of a collapsed building, not the firefighter. They're the ones who are going to bring you chicken dinner when you have a sickness in the family, right? Those are the people that you need to count on the most. And we build community resilience by establishing those networks. Now, you and I are from a generation where we grew up knowing everybody on our street, right? Right now, unfortunately, the preparedness messaging, and I'm going to go on a bit of a small tangent here. The preparedness messaging we get from the state teaches people to be professional victims, but it does so as an individual. The state is not trying to make communities resilient. The state is trying to make individuals resilient. So if we've created a set of messaging that is telling you to do this, not your community, not your neighborhood, and we change the language by, I coin it, changing the unit of measure. We need to stop talking about making prepared individuals, but making prepared communities. And that, I believe, has to come from the state. So the Red Cross issues messaging about how to make your community prepared by creating a preparedness community in your, right? It takes nothing to write on a piece of paper and put it in the doors of your 10 neighbors saying, I'm getting together on Thursday at noon to talk about preparedness if you're interested. It costs zero money. And you create great social capital. And I'll just end on this. We won't know that the elderly lady 3 doors down doesn't have any family in the local area to help her out in an emergency until we go and meet her, until we ask her, until we know her. If you think about high density housing and apartment buildings, that should be your greatest source of capital. You should have a really tightly knit group of individuals who are very well connected, but how many people in apartments are? I hope that answers your question. Tristan, you got a question? You're on mute.
Sorry, follow up from John if there is one.
No, I was just going to say thank you. Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. When we moved into our area, there was somebody like the local council had like the street party initiative, and we I thought this is a great idea. I hope somebody will organise a street party, and ended up thinking, is so we did. And about 4 years later, we had floods here, and it's that idea of knowing that there was, Betty down the street who was elderly and not very mobile, so we were all able to go down and sort of help her. And so I think, yeah, it's those little things that don't cost. Well, they are cost free, and the other thing is they don't take time. I think that's the other thing I hear a lot is people to say, "Oh, preparedness stuff, it takes so much time to do, and yet, if you actually time writing that out, your phone number and your name on a piece of paper and going sticking in the letterbox or whatever, it's like it's less time than it takes to boil a kettle for a cup of tea. So I think that's the other sort of myth buster that's important. But I'll shut up now.
No, that's absolutely that's key to that, is building those relationships. And it's the same as meeting your neighbor is the same as an emergency manager meeting the key leadership in their city. It takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. It doesn't take a lot. It sometimes takes a bit of effort, because you have to kind of build that relationship to make it worthwhile for the individual to come to you. And the reality is, I mean, when you look at the number of active duty firefighters per population on a per capita basis, and you start expressing that, and you have a significant event, you realize, actually, no, there's not going to be an immediate response to my house. Look at, and I know for some that are in New Zealand and, Christchurch, earthquakes. You can dial 999 or whatever it was in New Zealand all you want. Nobody is coming to help you, because they're first rescuing themselves out of their own building first, and then they're going to go where the need is greatest, and that's probably not you. So by building the social capital and building in your neighborhood and building community resilience, it is your neighborhood that rescues itself. Because I often said that communities have been responding to and recovering from disasters for time immemorial, right? And long before this thing called emergency management was invented. Patrick, you have your hand up there. Go ahead.
Great, Jeff. It's very interesting listening to your presentation. Thank you very much. I'm Patrick Schofield from South Africa and Zimbabwe, so African representative here. And we've got a platform that deals a lot with disaster relief. It's called Backer Buddy. It's the largest individual crowdfunding platform in Africa. We work very closely with an organization called Gift of the Givers, which is similar to Red Cross. It's a disaster relief organization, and just listening to one of the things we're building now. A question we've had is, when a disaster happens, how do you know who to speak to actually say, call out to that person, because you know that they are going to be the one who's going to be effective in organizing or coordinating food delivery or shelter or disaster relief as such. And what we looked at and what we kind of drilled it down to is what this is if you can identify a person's social capital, how trusted they are in the community, how connected they are, and how strong their shared norms are, and then you can identify the right people to work with when a disaster happens. So what I'm like, when you spoke about can we work with people's existing social capital, we're developing this thing, which is basically, we've put together 75 indicators to build out what we call the social capital scorecard. And the idea with that, and I'd love to chat to you further about this, and maybe other people in the group as well, is, so we've had fires, we've had floods and so forth within Southern Africa, and each time we've worked with Gift of the Givers and other organizations where people launch campaigns for resources and so forth, raise the funding, bring people together to provide relief. But if we can identify those people who previously have been effective in organizing, coordinating, and so forth, and are trusted by their communities, then we can say, when another disaster happens in the future, like as you said, Christchurch earthquake happened, there's probably going to be another one in the future. As you say, if you've already identified those people with high social capital through something like a scorecard, then you know who to speak to when a disaster happens. And that's what we're looking to do, is saying, can we use social capital as you said, the CEO is not the person who's necessarily the person who's everyone's going to listen to in the community. It's actually the person who's actually heading up, whichever section it is. And so what we've looked to is said, like, can we use social capital as an indicator to when a disaster happens to say, right, within that community, these are the 5 people with the strongest social capital scorecard. They're trusted, they're connected, they have very strong shared norms within the community. Speak to them. And so, like, I really liked when you spoke about saying, can we identify historically already where someone has strong social capital, and then work with them to say, can we engage with them for disaster relief now or support going forward? So I hope that's it. As I was saying, like, listening to what you've spoken about, I'm like, it ticks so many of the boxes where we've been saying we have thousands of campaigns that launch every month. Which one of those are going to be successful in disaster relief, and on the greatest impact space, and specifically using social capital as the indicator to say, right, these are the people who already have it, and those people lack. Therefore, we can help them build their social capital so that they will be more effective in their outcomes. So yeah, thanks.
And the idea of a scorecard is another fabulous idea of how to identify who has capabilities within and resources that you may want to tap into. And when you have especially in a preparedness, communications generally happen pre-event. So they happen in you're building relationships in times as FEMA refers to it as blue sky planning, when times of peace and calm. When you cross over into crisis communications and you only have the time to speak to a limited number of human beings to get important messages out, I'm arguing that is where social capital really can step up and prove its value, because I can tap into a faith network and get the message out to the congregation of the people of that faith community far faster than I will on Twitter, than I will on TikTok, than I will on a website, because that network exists, it's trusted. And like I said at the beginning, and you've seen this, is people turn to people in positions of trust. And if that trust is built, that's the key.
And Jeff, this is exactly what I'm speaking to, is that this concept of social capital, as we identified it, like, when a disaster happens, who do people listen to? And like, as you said, it's like, if you're able to measure that, through something like what we've come up with, the scorecard thing, and we're looking to validate indicators and so forth, which is why I'm actually starting to get involved, and I look forward to getting more involved in this community, is to say, firstly, that the indicators have to be valid, but then secondly, if before disaster happens in the preparedness space, if you already have 40 people in the community who out of those, there's 15 who are specifically strong in either connectedness or trustedness, but within that scorecard, when it happens, as you said, you've only got time to speak to 10 people. So who are the 10 who are actually going to be listened to by the community? And that's where I think the social capital concept becomes really powerful. Sorry, thanks.
Oh, no problem. Patrick, thank you. Cindy, you're next, and then we'll go to Thea.
Thank you. I'm Cindy Koopsen from the Netherlands, and I consider myself both a practitioner and a researcher. So I'm going to do the practitioner questioning in this, I think so. Because I was wondering, because it sounds very logical. You can map it, you can identify the key leaders, but are the key leadership positions the same when you look from a preparedness perspective as well as from a crisis management perspective? Or is there perhaps a difference between the two? And who do you call when you have identified 5 people and they all died in the disaster moment? So is it about individuals in the key leadership, or is it access points to certain communities? That's a 2-question thing, I think. Pick something to answer.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. It's about creating relationships. It starts with the key position and the key leadership, because you have to identify a human. You have to identify a gateway into an existing network of value. I think that's important to do. When it comes time for an actual event happens, a lot of the times what I've seen work in the past is I'm building a set of trust with you, and hopefully as a member of the community, if you're the practitioner, you're reaching out to me, I see value. Eventually, when you set the enabling environment, we create that social capital. You create the message I'm creating about the need to seek information in times of need. What I generate, though, is hopefully you pass on to your community through your trusted pathway that when the balloon goes up, when the bad day happens, I, as the public sector, am going to speak on this platform. As the population, this is where I want you to go to find out what I have to say. And if there's direction from the government that needs to be followed, it will only be over here at this trusted source. Because then if both you and I are unfortunate casualties of the event, the system itself built on the social capital is established, it's set up, and it's ready to go. Right? So that is, I think, the more important underlying. It always starts with Cindy and I sitting in a room and getting to know each other and building a level of trust and norms of reciprocity, but it engages the networks. So then it takes away what you rightly cite as a danger, because if it's just two people who get along really, really well and they're on vacation in the Caribbean when something happens, that can be a challenge. It's real. It's, because bad things don't happen when you're sitting in front of your computer ready to go. They always happen on a Saturday evening at 7 p.m. So hopefully, does that answer your question, Cindy? Okay, perfect. Tia, go ahead, and then we'll go to Alicia.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, hi. So I'm Tia Pefken. I'm a PhD student from Berlin, Germany. So hello from Germany. But I'm also probably more on the research side. But as you said earlier, you said that you're building resilience through relationships. And this is actually exactly what I'm trying to argue in my current project. But as that social capital influences organizational resilience. So I'm a bit further away, since I rather look at organizations and their resilience. And by the way, I'm very open to discuss any topics relating social capital networks and organizational resilience. So feel free to reach out to me as well. But I've been working with a few companies in the last months, and every issue that I have with social capital identification is data protection. I do see the very big value of social capital, but every example that we've discussed now, I keep thinking of it, because in practice, there seems to be a lot of issues with personal data also in preparedness. So of course, I guess Germany is maybe very strict rather than other countries on that. But what are your general thoughts on this topic? Because I think this is a big topic that has to be addressed when talking about this.
And thanks for the question. I absolutely agree, because privacy concerns are only, I would argue, getting more and more important in society, especially with the evolution of AI into networks and access and gathering that kind of data. When I talk about networks, it's about setting the conditions for passing the messages. So it's building the network, building the connectedness between the public sector or the corporate, because this works equally whether you're a public sector practitioner for the government, or whether you are in charge of emergency management for a corporation. It's the same level of connectedness with the sectors within your organization for which you're responsible. And I don't advocate for the collecting of personal data. I advocate for the establishment of pathways. And so, do I need to know your name and phone number? Probably, yeah, I do need to know contact information to build the resilience. Am I trying to get the name, the phone number, the address, and the email of everybody in your network? No. I don't advocate for that. Some want to build this massive distributional database of points of contact. Again, I think that rears its head of the dangers of data privacy. I'm more about connecting the networks. I don't want to speak to the Catholic diocese. I want the Catholic diocese to speak to their population on my behalf with my message. Right. So I'm not looking to access the contact information of the followers of the Catholic faith. I want to persuade the priests that the information we have is valuable and important to the population so that they say it at Sunday sermon. I don't want to be paraded into an organization and stand up front with a cute little crest on my shirt and say, listen to me, I'm the smart guy, because people don't, that doesn't work, right? Trusted pathways work when I want the information to come across. So I hopefully that kind of addresses what you're talking, because I'm not trying to collect that and I don't advocate it, but I can most certainly see where institutions, and rightfully so, would push back against a massive collection of personal data. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much for answering this. The only thing that I see then is that how would you identify the people that you like that are important without actually collecting that kind of data?
You can't. There's going to be a small collection. I don't think you can avoid it. And I don't think you can, you're going to have to maintain the connection, like the bridging social capital, the people in the middle that are connected to the organizations. You are going to have to maintain that. And you're going to have to follow data privacy regulations wherever you are. I don't think there's a way to do it without maintaining some part of data, but I think it only needs to be on a limited basis.
Thank you so much.
All right. You're welcome. Alicia, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And then we'll go to Abraham and then Julie.
It's close enough. It's going fine. I just want to speak up on behalf of the AAI, which is like but it is a great way to build social capital. Emergency managers are trying to hand out umbrellas on sunny days, and we wonder why.
You're breaking up slightly. Sorry, I'm only getting about every third word that you're saying.
Oh, no. Sorry, it's my microphone.
Happy if you want to type it in the chat, and then we can, and then I can just jump to Abraham and then come back to your question in the chat if you would like to do that.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I just want to make sure that you get a chance to speak, but that we can actually hear you. So we're going to go to Abraham. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Maybe I want to hear from you on like the actual resource in terms of like the social capital embedded in these societal institutions. In this context, maybe in your presentation, maybe for the communication purpose, like for emergency preparedness, okay, the way you indicated the network and the other issues may work. But in my case, for example, I'm currently a PhD student. I'm working one of my paper among the 3 articles for my requirements. One is on can maybe social capital work as maybe can social capital help to insure against shocks? That was what the question I want to answer. That is in the context of the rural setting in Ethiopia. So there are informal local institutions here in Ethiopia. They are informal. So I want to see the network size and also like the connections there and how much resources are available to each of the individual in these networks, and when they face shock, would that help to ensure them against so that was my interest. And one of the basic issue in this case is, since the shock is covariate, like your case, it is maybe when you say disaster is going to affect everybody in the network, maybe. So in terms of accessing the actual resource from the network, that some people argue that, okay, social capital may not help in terms of like ensuring against those disaster shock issues. So I want to hear from you on this issue. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. And the idea that I'm trying to argue is that social capital sets the conditions. It's a precondition, you could almost argue, for sharing other resources, right? So I'm going to build a relationship with you ahead of time. Now, in rural Ethiopia, and I'm going to date myself, I did a little bit of studying in that area way back in the 1980s. So I'm dating myself for those of you who might not have been around in the 1980s. That it's a great example of both the institutional presence of the government, and I would argue a stronger cultural presence that exists in rural communities. Maybe less so in urban communities, depending, you could argue either way, but there's a strong sense of culture and institutional presence. But the idea being is setting the conditions pre-event, which is why I define preparedness as pre-event activities in times of peace and calm, building that social capital. It creates that network or gives you access to a network that then you can leverage when the time comes to access it. And we do not know, we simply do not know when an event occurs, what part of the networks are going to be affected. We can't foresee that. We don't know. But as a large network, being able to reach out to all different parts of society, we're able to social capital access that lubricant to be able to enable the flow of other capitals. So we're able to flow the capitals of physical capital, human capital, financial capital flows along that pre-deserved, because I'm not going to loan you money if I don't know you. I have to know you first to loan my shovel. So in other words, I have to create the social capital with you first before I turn around and you get access to my physical resources. So that's the kind of argument I think that serves best. Is we can't guarantee that access will be there, but we can most certainly use that. Establish a social capital and use that pre-event to access the networks. And a huge shout out to anybody out there who happens to be doing their PhD. I know exactly what that journey is all about. I have all the respect in the world for every one of you. And if any of you ever want to know about social capital, PhD and theories and stuff like that, feel free to reach out directly to me on LinkedIn. It's Jeff Donaldson, PhD, etc. So I'm going to read Alicia's question, and then we're going to go to Julie's question, and then we're going to wrap up this session. So just give me 10 seconds here to read. And I absolutely agree. So you can all read the question in the chat there from Alicia, or pardon me if I'm mispronouncing your name, to advocate for the after action process. We shouldn't forget that it can be done afterward. And that's absolutely true. And I think that's an essential element. And there's a lot of really, really wonderful people studying the idea of the after action, the idea of how do we learn? How do we learn as not only as a human species, but how do we learn as a community? And how do we take the lessons that went well and didn't go well and inform our processes, right? My argument that I'll make to you is that if you set up that social capital pre-event and we have these positive relationships, after we navigate a crisis, we're going to have I would argue, a greater predisposition to get together again, because we're going to have a sense of connectedness where we will get together again and we will talk about the issues that happen and how we can better set our communities up for response. I don't know, and this is never a fault of the emergency manager or the person from the corporation responsible. It's very difficult when you're 1.5 people supporting a city of 400,000 to know exactly what happened on the ground. And if you do not get an opportunity to talk to the affected population, you'll very likely not learn what happened on the ground. And you're very likely to repeat the same actions, not mistakes necessarily, but you're going to repeat something because you weren't informed as to what exactly happened on the ground. So hopefully that addresses that. And we will go to Julie. Thank you for being patient.
No, that's no problem. I'm Julie, I'm from the UK, and I'm a specialist public health practitioner working in local government. I think one of the challenges that we face is that in local government, we really understand the personalised nature of networks and meeting people where they are. But we have a challenge that comes from central government where they seek to standardise processes or to put frameworks around things, and almost there's a bit of lack of trust. And it goes back to Thea's point around sharing data. So they would really rather that we handed over our data so that they could communicate with those networks directly. There's also lots of questions about, well, why don't you have access to this network or that network? Or we think we know this about this population and you're telling us that that's not the way that you communicate with that population. And I just wondered if you had any tips or advice for practitioners to have that argument with people about, you know, what is social capital, and that it's not something that you can necessarily put a plan around and say, this is how we should communicate with people in times of crisis.
I think there's a couple of avenues. The first one that pops into my mind is understanding the needs of the population. And I'll give you an example from my personal research I did a study in one town where the government thought that the most important thing to do was rehook up the power. Obviously, that's number one. Let's get the power. We're throwing all our resources against it. But when you talk to the population, it was mobility. They wanted to check on their neighbors. So they could care less, like if it takes a couple extra days for the power to get on. They wanted the city to clear the streets, to repair the bridges, to work on mobility issues. So what you had was a city working really, really hard at something that they thought was the priority, when it in fact was not serving what the population wanted. And so unless you have a sense of connectedness and a sense of relationship with the population you serve, it's very difficult for you to identify the needs. What is the priority of the town that you serve in the UK? What do they want you to do? Because often in emergency management, it's a hierarchical system, very much like the military. This is how we do it. This is how it's executed. And sometimes what I talk about here is paradigm challenging, right? It challenges how business is normally done. Why do you need to meet these people? Why do you need to connect with them? Well, you can argue that preparedness communications, nobody's listening. They're not. I mean, you can do studies all you want. Nobody is listening to the preparedness communications that are being issued. You don't know what we don't know what the needs of the population are. We don't know what the priorities of the population are. Hey, maybe if we actually talk to them, it'd be pretty cool. And by the way, it doesn't cost any money, right? Okay, maybe a little bit of coffee and a couple of muffins at a get together. But the reality is the important investments that I argue for is an investment of time, not capital. And sometimes that's persuasive, in that I'm not talking about relaunching a whole new marketing campaign with an incredible amount of new material to be thrown out in a pamphlet and printing budgets and et cetera. No, I'm talking about the longitudinal behavioral change where we make it part of our practice to regularly engage with people of the population. I'll leave you with one example. There's a city outside of the city of Toronto, and the emergency manager there tells me his gauge is if he spends more than 50% of his day in his office, he's failing his job. Because his job as the emergency manager is to be in the city with the population, getting to know them, understanding their needs, and being where they are. So if half his day or more is in the office, he's missing out on where he should really be. Again, you're pushing against a hierarchical paradigm, but one of the benefits are you're doing something that that doesn't cost any money, which is generally the pushback from a lot of top level organizations is, I need to change my marketing campaign. Well, who's going to build it, right? And again, that gets back to one of the challenges I spoke about the level of economic resources that are available in emergency management is slim, and it's not going to improve. I hopefully that does that address your question?
Yeah, no, that was really helpful. I think it's just that thing about seeking to control or do things in the same way in every place when that's not appropriate for the populations that differ across the patch. And I noticed that Jason's put a comment in the box that kind of backs that up. Is it's a real challenge for us, and we on the ground can have those conversations, and we have those really great examples of what is the impact of engaging with populations where they are, instead of saying we should communicate with them in this way because that's what the national framework says, but actually getting to that point. And maybe there's something about sharing that narrative and those examples with policymakers to demonstrate the impact of that more frequently, maybe. Something to think about.
And Julie, you're absolutely, and I think that to amplify what Jason says, if you have evidence, I mean, sometimes you have to go out and get the evidence yourself to say that, listen, here's your plan, but when we talk to the community, this is what they're talking about. Now you have evidence to back up your position to say, maybe we should think about reorientating how we speak to the community, how we're engaged in the community. And I had one conversation with a politician once, and I'm not saying this is the best way to do it, but when you're dealing with the political side, their number one desire is to what? Is to get reelected, right? So if your emergency management follows what the population wants and it's backing up the population interest and you're serving the population, that can't be a bad outcome for somebody who wants to remain popular with the population. I mean, sometimes you have to be a little innovative in your strategies with elected officials because a lot of times they will just default to the paradigm that says the national direction says this is how we execute emergency management in the UK. This is how we do it in Canada. This is how we do it in South Africa. This is how we do it. Follow it, do this. And that's why, and I'll end it on this one last little rant, simply because every year in Canada, we have something called Emergency Preparedness Week. And I'm sure it happens elsewhere in the world. You have your 1 week, you say your cute little things, nobody pays any attention, no behavior is changed, everybody pats themselves in the back, and they go back to normal operations. That's essentially what we do every year. I write blogs and articles about it. Here we go again, rinse and repeat. And if the emergency management community doesn't change the way they engage with the population, how do they expect the population to change their behaviors? And that's kind of why I'm sitting on this. So I'll leave it at that because we're 13 minutes past. I'll just before I turn it back over to Tristan for any final organizational points, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here, taking the time out of your day. Your most important resource you have is time. For joining us here. If you're interested and you have nothing to do, I'm happy to see you again in 11 hours when we offer this at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. If not, thank you for joining us. And I honestly say, please reach out if you want to start a conversation. Join me on LinkedIn, and I strongly encourage you to become a member of the special interest group. It's free of charge. It's where we can have these conversations. It's where we can post thoughts, articles back and forth on each other. And I think it's a space that we're desperately in need of as a community. And I think it can do, I think we can do great things. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass it over to Tristan if he has any closing words before we shut this down.
Thanks, Jeff. No, it's been a fantastic session. There's clearly a lot of interest in this topic, and this platform provides a space for people to be able to come together and share their ideas, get support, identify opportunities for collaboration, all the wonderful things that come from social capital. We're interested in social capital. We can build some social capital right here. So I posted a link again in the chat to the community platform. As Jeff mentioned, everyone's free and welcome to join that space. It's on Mighty Networks, which is a pretty great platform. You can either join it through the web browser on your computer, or you can actually download the app and find the community that way and join it as well, or do both, in fact, so you can get notifications on your phone. So Jeff, you're the chair of this interest group. Where are we going from here? Are we going to meet again in a few months?
So absolutely, we're going to put some information into the special interest group about what format you would like to see again. This is just an idea and a research that I'm doing, so I wanted to start off with that. Would we like to have webinars? Would you like to see a panel of 3 or 4 people get together to discuss this issue, an open question and answer period? So we're going to put a bunch of different ideas for the next iteration. Ideally, at least quarterly, if not more frequent than that, we're going to get together in a forum like this to discuss interesting ideas. But please watch that space. In the next couple of days, I'm going to put some information in there for everybody about giving you an opportunity to jump on a doodle poll to talk about, or a different poll to talk about where we go from here. Where would you like to see? Because again, we're trying to foster that sense of social capital, that sense of connectedness. So we want this space to reflect how you want to engage with the space, far less than us dictating, here's your next presenter, here's your next presenter, here's your next presenter. What is of most value to you, and how do we construct the box to give you the most value out of this? Because that's the point. If you're not gathering value out of being part of this organization, we just become another group that is pointless to be there. So we're trying to create that space to create value for everybody that's in there and give you an opportunity. And if anybody has a piece of something they're working on and you're looking for feedback, again, what a great space to jump in there. You've got a bunch of interested people who work in the space. You've got a question that you're not sure how to solve. You can ask Google Scholar, or you can ask a special interest group. I just think that's pretty cool. So that's where we're going, Tristan.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jeff.
All right, everybody, have the happy rest